Today's episode is from an interview on BMO's In Tune podcast that was recorded on February 19th, 2025. In Tune features equity research analysts from BMO Capital Markets and explores key emerging themes, trends, and issues, which are important to our institutional clients globally. In this episode, Rohitesh Dhawan, CEO and President of the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, and Camilla Sutton, BMO's Head of Equity Research for Canada and the UK, explore the industry's progress, key achievements, and what's next.
Welcome to Sustainability Leaders. I'm Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO. On this show, we will talk with leading sustainability practitioners from the corporate, investor, academic, and NGO communities to explore how this rapidly evolving field of sustainability is impacting global investment, business practices, and our world.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Bank of Montreal, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
Today, as we are about to kick off BMO's 34th annual Global Metals, Mining, and Critical Minerals Conference, we welcome to our In Tune podcast a multi-year repeat guest, Rohitesh Dhawan, President and CEO of ICMM. Accordingly, our entire conversation today will focus on the contribution of metals and mining to sustainable development. Ro, thank you for joining us both live at our conference and also for this podcast year after year. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Let's start with a bit of a visionary question. ICMM's actions on responsible mining began almost 2 decades ago. A lot has changed in that time, both in politics, societal norms, right across the board, really. So to what extent have your commitments endured through those changes? And really, what is your outlook for the future?
Camilla, thank you so much for having me. And let me just say off the bat, a big thank you to you and your colleagues at BMO for everything you do for the mining industry. I'm not just saying that, I truly mean it. You have provided some of the best platforms for conversation and to move the industry forward, and we're deeply grateful. Camilla, the straight answer to your question is that our resolve on responsible mining practices and a commitment to sustainability has never been stronger. And that's not a political statement. It's actually simply hard-nosed commercial reality. And to explain what I mean by that, it may be useful for me to just recap where ICMM actually came from and how it was developed. Because in 2002, when the body was established by 5 of the world's leading mining companies at the time, it was answering a call from society. This wasn't the industry coming together and saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had a group where we could advocate for ourselves? Not at all. It was 5,000 people that were consulted over an 18-month period who said, it would be great if you had a body in the mining industry where the CEOs came together and stood up for what's right and took principled action on the issues that matter to society. And that's how ICMM was born. And so we've always tried to stay true to our ethos as an entity that owes society for us to show leadership for how mining can be done in the interest of the common good. And so over the last 22 years, I'm really proud of the progress that the industry has made as a result of coming together and agreeing on the things that will guide our actions. And one of our first commitments continues to remain the thing that people look at and say, yes, we need more of that. For instance, when ICMM members said, no matter how great the resource, no matter how great the need, there are some parts of the world we simply will not mine because the risk of damaging them is too great. And that's why we said, for instance, that we won't mine in World Heritage Sites. But over those last 22 years, and particularly, Camilla, in the last 3 years, we have tried to show leadership on the issues that are driving our planetary and societal crises. Now, that has to do with decarbonization, with nature positive, with human rights, with the rights of indigenous people, with building a more circular economy, with managing our tailings more safely, with mining with less waste, and with being really transparent about our contributions to society and to government. And as we look to the next 5 years, a number of those issues have unfinished business. And so we will continue driving hard to bring down fatalities, to reduce emissions, to achieve better outcomes for nature, to be better local neighbors, and to be better stewards of the lands in which we operate, and to be more transparent. Not because of any political view on these issues, but because it's in the interest of our businesses and in the interest of our stakeholders.
Definitely in the interest of all of that, Ro. In the current climate, I'll be curious to get your views here on, who really plays a leadership role here. Obviously, ICMM does, but in addition, when you think this through, what industry players really can play a leadership role here?
Camilla, there are at least three groups of people that have to stand up at this moment in time if we are to really meet the need of the hour. The first is the industry. And I'm proud to say that ICMM is willing to rise up to that challenge and show that from within the industry, there are a group of CEOs, 24 in our case, that absolutely continue to be committed to showing the path to a more sustainable, a more responsible industry that enables a more responsible society. So, we are front and center of it. We want to walk the walk. We're not just here to say nice things, but to show action on the ground. But then, Camilla, there are certain issues where it is neither appropriate nor, frankly, possible for the industry to be the one that's leading the charge. Take the example of green premiums. And this is the commonly held view that unless we attach a higher price premium to more responsibly produced metals and minerals, that people will always be incentivized to choose the less responsible way of producing them because they'll say, well, why bother if I'm going to be paid the same price for it? Now, currently, there isn't a well-functioning market for these green premiums, particularly on the exchanges on which these products are traded. Now, we as the industry simply cannot and should not be the ones that are designing these green premium instruments because that would rightly be seen as anti-competitive. Our antitrust lawyers have told us that that would be a classic case of an industry colluding to manipulate prices for your own interest, even though that's clearly not the reason we would do it. But for that reason, we are very clear that that is not a set of actions that we are willing to take. And so I really hope that a combination of governments and the exchanges step forward to find a solution to this problem, because that kind of thing can really unlock change at scale when it comes to being able to drive better performance across the mining industry. And so that can't be the industry showing leadership. That's going to have to be a combination of governments and the exchanges. So it's going to take a whole of society effort to get there. People should have no qualms or doubts about the fact that the industry is right here and wanting to drive change. But in some cases, we're going to need others to take the lead.
So you've talked over the years at great length about the commitments that members make and how important they are, including the focus on everything from direct operations, the value chains, the landscape, and the economic system. Can you talk to these, where you've seen progress being made and where you're focused on right now?
Absolutely, Camilla. So if I think about the three issues where I feel that we have achieved significant progress, even though work isn't fully done, but which show us what the future needs to look like, the first would be on decarbonization, where when it comes to the electricity that many of the world's largest mines use, we are now already either using entirely renewable energy or have a pathway to get there. And that's extraordinary. If 5 or 10 years ago, you would have said to somebody that the world's largest copper mine, Escondida, is 100% powered by renewable energy, people wouldn't have believed that that's possible, yet it is. If you would have said that Anglo American, one of the world's largest mining companies, would use only renewable energy across Latin America and Australia in all their operations, you would have said you're mad. And yet that's what's happened. And I can give you many, many more examples of that. So I'm really pleased at just how quickly mines have not just decarbonized their own electricity supply, but they've been catalysts for entire economies like South Africa to decarbonize their power systems, given what an important structural player we are. And linked to that, we're also making great progress on decarbonizing our trucks, which are hard to do because diesel is such an important fuel source for the kind of power that these trucks and other equipment have to put out, as well as working with our suppliers on reducing our emissions through the value chain. So decarb generally, I think, is a bright spark and shows what's really possible when we come together and set ambitious goals and really get behind them to deliver change. The second area is water. And in many countries, water is a far more important local issue than almost anything else that falls into the bucket of sustainability topics. And here too, we have many mines around the world that are delivering solutions on water for the benefit of the community while still making their operations more resilient in a world of climate change where, of course, water availability is going to become a lot more challenging. I've just returned recently from a visit to Chile, where Antofagasta's operations at Los Pelambres has just commissioned a new desalination plant. And by having this desalinated water supply the operation, they've actually been able to hand back the rights to continental water that they were given by the government for use by the community. Isn't that wonderful? Because now when you stand at the operation and you look down on the Choapa Valley, what you see is just beautiful, green, lush agriculture taking place in some of the driest parts of the world, which simply would not have been possible had the mine not invested in desalination, thus giving back those water rights. And so really pleased to see how well water is being managed by our companies in some of the most important and tricky jurisdictions in the world. And the third area where I think we've made real considerable progress is on the issue of tailings management. And when I say tailings, of course, I mean the waste rock from mining operations that are stored in these large dams, which are some of the most complex engineering structures on Earth. And we learned very tragically in 2019, when one of them collapsed in Brazil, killing 272 people, what can happen if these aren't managed well. But thanks to the efforts of the investors through the Principles for Responsible Investment, through the UN and through ICMM coming together, we now have a global industry standard which all ICMM members are committed to, and which I'm really pleased to see is having broader uptake in the wider industry so that tailings dams around the world are being managed as safely as they can. So decarbonization, water, and tailings are three areas where I think there's been considerable progress, and I feel really inspired by what I see. But Camilla, just to flag a couple of areas where I think we have much further to go. When it comes to fatalities and safety in the industry, we are so far from where we need to be. Our goal is clear. We have to have environments of zero harm. That starts with bringing fatalities down to zero, but it extends to psychological harm too. And we've got a lot of work to do there. And that's going to be a huge focus for ICMM going forward. Our work on nature positive, generating really good early results, but our goals are very ambitious. We've said that we want to achieve no net loss of biodiversity at all our mine sites against a 2020 baseline by the time we close them. That's no small feat, in addition to working with our suppliers to reduce their impact on nature. And then finally, if I just touch on the topic of human rights more broadly and our impact on society, we are all absolutely committed to doing the right thing, to upholding human rights at all times. But I have to be honest that in some cases, there is a gap between what we want to happen and what we're committed to doing and the realities on the ground. And not all of that is down to us, but it shows how we need to keep working to integrate human rights due diligence into absolutely everything we do. And again, that's going to be a big focus for us going forward.
Ro, you could teach a class in communication. I'm going to get our listeners to rewind there and listen to that again, because you had packed so much into that answer that was incredibly valuable. Thank you. So you mentioned nature. Can you talk us through TNFD? What is it? What's the vision for it? How should we be thinking about it?
Camilla, it's such a good question. So TNFD stands for the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and it's the cousin to TCFD, which was the same initiative for climate that was started a few years ago. And the logic behind the two things is actually very sound, which is that unless the market values and understands risks related to either climate or nature, we will never be able to see the kind of change in the investment landscape and in corporate action that's necessary to orient business practices in line with what the world demands through our climate and nature crises. And at the same time, we're leaving money on the table because by investing in nature and climate positive solutions, it can generate significant value for all stakeholders, including for shareholders. And so TNFD is now a few years old as this effort to drive markets to better understand, account for, price, and reward actions that contribute to a nature-positive future. I'm so proud to say, Camilla, that we have been long-term supporters of TNFD right from its beginning. We were the sector piloting partners, ICMM, to TNFD when it came to mining and metals. And mining and metals was one of the first sectors that stepped up and said, yes, pilot this framework on us. And many people thought, wow, mining, you dig holes in the ground, and yet you're willing to be seen and be held accountable to be leaders on nature. And that's absolutely the case because we are fundamentally a nature-based industry. I'm also pleased to say that some of the earliest adopters of the TNFD framework were mining companies, including ICMM members. And that's a source of great pride for us, because here too, we're showing that principled leadership from the mining industry can not only lead to change in our sector, but hopefully drive change across the economy. Camilla, with all of that being said, and I hope it's coming through very clearly how seriously committed we are to TNFD, there is one part of TNFD that I wish was different. And that is that the TNFD system is designed for single materiality primarily. What I mean by that is it's asking the TNFD adopters, companies, to understand the actions of the company on nature. So it's single, one-way, company to nature. What do you do that has a positive impact? What do you do that has a negative impact on nature? And that's vital information for investors to understand. What I really hope companies don't lose in that is the double materiality attitude that you should be having to nature as well as to other issues, which is to say, yes, on the one hand, I have to understand my impact on nature, but I also need to understand how nature is built into my business model and how it has an impact on me. And that's the area where TNFD may not automatically drive companies to. There are elements in it that force you to think that way, but it isn't as hardwired as what we would love to see. Because for us, it is so important that we understand that two-way relationship. Otherwise, you end up seeing nature as just yet another input into your linear economic model, when in reality, everything is teaching us that things are so interdependent, and we've got to understand those impacts and how they work in unison. So really, really important. I hope all investors and corporates are taking this very, very seriously. And I would just encourage everybody to go even further in some cases than what TNFD is asking for, to make sure you get that double materiality assessment going on in how you think about this.
And what about Consolidated Mining Standards? We've talked a bit about this previously. It's really important work. Where do we stand with it now?
So, Camilla, to answer that question, I have to let everybody know that around the world, we estimate that there are in the region of 25,000 mining companies that within, across them operate nearly 30,000 mine sites. And although we as ICMM members are 1/3 of the global industry by production, we're only 24 companies and we have 650 mines. So yes, by production, you have some of the largest miners, all committed to being responsible, all committed to doing the right thing. But the realities for people on the ground are going to be impacted far more by what the 24,976 do, because just by sheer number of them and the mine sites, that's what's going to affect whether rights are upheld, whether nature is preserved, whether waterways are preserved, whether there's pollution, and whether there's mining in the common good. And so up until now, we've had many, many different ways of showing that you're a responsible producer, one of which is following the ICMM standard, but you've got to be a member of ICMM to follow that standard. And so we came together with 3 other major standards and said, hey, why don't we bring ourselves together into one consolidated standard? That makes life easier for the companies that are adopting any one of our standards anyway, because many are doing more than one. So great, there's a benefit there. But the much bigger objective here is to produce something that can be used by any mine producing any commodity anywhere in the world, which shows them a very clear blueprint for how to be a responsible company and to improve continuously over time. Now, the most important thing, were we to do this, is to make sure that that cannot be controlled or be directed purely by the industry. Because people will rightly say, hang on, how can you set your own standard and govern it yourselves? Shouldn't you have others at the table do it with you? And we fully agree. And that's why we're in the process right now of consolidating these 4 standards and establishing the entity that will have a board that is independent, where the industry will have no greater power than other stakeholder groups, including indigenous representatives, NGOs, investors, users of metal. They will all have a say in what this consolidated standard has in it, how it is assured, and how the system is governed. And so what I'm really hoping that happens as a result of this is that small and mid-sized companies around the world realize that they now have a blueprint they can follow. That is absolutely and unapologetically a high bar that you have to meet, but it gives you support to meet that high bar from wherever your starting point. So if you're a leading mining company, like you are, like many in the ICMM are, then there's a level for you in the standard that you can demonstrate leading practice. You can only get the accreditation under this standard if you're at good practice. But if you're not yet there and you're just an early starter on the sustainability journey, there's also a foundational practice for you to be able to use to start becoming more responsible. And so we went out and did a public consultation last year and said, hey, here's the standard we propose. What do you think? Fortunately, we got loads of really good input, a lot of it confirming that this is the right way to think about the consolidated standard landscape. And in some cases, people said, hey, I think you've got this wrong. And I think you're missing this. And so we're digesting all of that feedback. We're going to put it back out for a second public consultation later this year with the aim that in the next 12 months, this standard is available. It's out there. It's governed independently. And all mining companies have a way to manage their operations that's consistent. And that means, Camilla, at the end of the day, that investors and other stakeholders also have a simple way of holding people to account. And what I really, really, really hope happens as a result of this is other sectors say, hey, if the miners can do it, we can do it too. And I hope what this will do is spur consolidation of responsible production standards in other sectors. So not only does mining then have a more consolidated way of measuring good performance, but other sectors do as well.
It's a wonderful vision, Ro. I look forward to celebrating more success there. You've introduced us over the years to the concept of the trust deficit. You've talked about it for a long time. And from your perspective, I'm curious to understand, has there been progress here? Have we managed to lessen that deficit?
Camilla, there's good news and bad news. Let's start with the good news first. The good news is that when we saw the data for 2024 on the extent to which people in 32 countries that were surveyed believe that the mining industry fulfills its responsibilities to society, over the last 3 years, we have seen consistent year-on-year improvement. So good news is that we are seemingly achieving a better relationship with our stakeholders when it comes to their perception of whether we are fulfilling our responsibilities to society. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we're still bottom of the 18 sectors that were assessed on this metric. And we have stayed at the bottom for pretty much the last 2 decades. And this data has been collected since 2001. So it tells us that although we are indeed making progress, we're not making progress fast enough, and we're not necessarily achieving the kind of breakthrough changes in the way people think about the mining industry. Then that might be holding the industry back when it comes to our access to permits, our access to capital, our access to talent, and most importantly, our social license to operate with people in local communities. Now, that's a global picture, but it does vary, of course, by geography. And there are parts of the world where the industry is already fairly popular and well considered, where we've seen even further rises in the last year or so. I would call out Saudi Arabia, China, and Indonesia here as real bright spots. And then there are other parts of the world where our reputation seems to have suffered even more in the last year. And the US, interestingly, is in that bucket of countries where the perception around mining by this metric has gone down. Now, I should note that a country like Chile always comes through very clearly as a real bright spot where the industry's reputation stands out and is considered to be one of the leading sectors. And in the case of Chile, actually, the most desirable employer for graduates in the last year was a mining company, Codelco. And so that's telling us that there are regional nuances, but the global picture is clear, that we still have a trust deficit between stakeholders in the mining industry. And that is why the work we're trying to do through the Consolidated Mining Standard is so important, because that's a piece of the puzzle to getting people to see and hold mining accountable for what counts as good practice. Until now, we haven't had that. In addition, Camilla, what we're trying to do is to create spaces for the industry to come together with our stakeholders and debate some of these thorny and difficult issues that might be holding back the trust that people can place in the mining industry. If I just take one little example of that, some people in civil society would say that the mining industry does not pay its fair share of taxes, that we perhaps extract a lot from the producing countries and don't leave everything behind. And that's a valid question to ask. And so let's get some data, let's see what the situation is, and let's have a conversation on that basis. And so just last week, ICMM released the taxes that our members have paid around the world, as we've done for the last 10 years. And what it shows is that last year we paid $42 billion in corporate income tax and royalty to host governments. That's down from the year ago, quite considerably down from a year ago. And that's because the profits we made are down from a year ago, thanks to lower commodity prices and higher inflation. But what's really important for us to help others see is that as a percentage of our profits, that number's a lot higher. So last year, for every dollar of profit that we made, 40 cents went back to governments in taxes. Now, I struggle to think of another sector that's paying 40 cents out of every dollar of profit made back to host countries, just in corporate income tax and royalties, let alone things like payroll or property taxes. But some might say, hang on, that's not enough. Well, okay, let's sit down and have a conversation on that basis and figure out what would be fair. And that's the kind of thing I'm hoping, Camilla, we'll be able to do more of in the future. Another argument that people might have is that where you mine something, you should also beneficiate it. So don't just mine the bauxite here, also smelt the aluminium here. Again, there are a lot of things we need to think about. Is there enough energy? Is the cost structure competitive? Is the infrastructure there? Is it actually going to add more value to the local economy? And when we start to get a grip on some of these more difficult issues, I think we're going to start to see that level of trust change in the industry.
Ro, before we close out our conversation here, I wanted to give you the opportunity just to sum up a few thoughts or to give us your parting words that you would really like listeners to be left with.
Camilla, the thing I've been most thinking about, which I'm sure is on other people's minds as well, is where do we go from here? What are the next few years in terms of a commitment to being a responsible actor look like, given the changes happening in our world? And I just want to once again emphasize that certainly for ICMM members, but I think this is true for many other companies too, the reasons they initially committed to being a responsible actor are still as true today, if not stronger, than they might have been in the past. And I think the thing we've got to continue to keep front of mind for ourselves is that often what's in society's best interest is also in business's best interests. But those of us, and I include myself in this, who believe that have done a poor job of communicating that to others who may feel that some of the actions that companies have taken to be more responsible have come at the expense of their profitability, when in reality, it couldn't be further from the truth in most cases. But we've got to do, as advocates of responsible business, a much, much better job than we have done in the past to show that good business also means responsible business. And I fear that in the process of fixing a dirty world, we've made profit a dirty word. And that's something that us as proponents of responsible business have to reckon with and make sure we do a better job of in the next few years so that we can build a better societal consensus around the kind of private sector we want.
I love where you've taken us on this podcast, Ro. Thank you for joining us again. That was Rohitesh Dhawan, CEO and President of ICMM.
Thanks for listening to Sustainability Leaders. This podcast is presented by BMO. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. Press the follow button if you want to get notified when new episodes are published. We value your input, so please leave a rating, review, and any feedback that you might have, or visit us at bmo.com/sustainability leaders. Our show and resources are produced with support from BMO's marketing team and Puddle Creative. Until next time, thanks for listening, and have a great week.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.